Welcome to Gibraltar, the storied British overseas territory located on the very southern tip of Europe's Iberian Peninsula. Though it might be the smallest British overseas territory by size, there's no doubting Gibraltar's wealth of heritage. And on this walk around the city on a sunny Mediterranean day, we'll explore everything from the city's two spectacular cathedrals to the mighty fortifications which protected this territory against enemies for years. While we'll also navigate the narrow alleyways of the densely packed city centre, take a stroll around some of the largest and busiest squares in town, and then climb up the side of the famous Rock of Gibraltar, where we'll be treated to some stunning views over the city, and where we'll also find the fascinating remains of the more than 1200-year-old Moorish castle. All of that is to come over the next hour, but we begin our walk right in the heart of Gibraltar's bustling city centre, gazing up at a famous building known locally as Number 6. This fetching landmark is the headquarters of the Gibraltarian government, taking its intriguing nickname from its address, Number 6 Convent Place. Now, despite being very much British, Gibraltar is a self-governing overseas territory, with its own government and parliament able to make laws independently of the United Kingdom. This is just one of the many parts that make up the unique Gibraltarian identity, often best symbolised by the territory's instantly recognisable coat of arms here, which features a famous red castle, said to represent the fortress of Gibraltar, and a golden key, which symbolises the territory's role as the so-called key to the Mediterranean. Through the centuries, Gibraltar has been a key asset for the Moors, the Spanish, and today the British. Its strategic geographical position overlooking the narrow Strait of Gibraltar, where the Mediterranean meets the Atlantic Ocean, one of the many reasons that you'll encounter quintessentially British sites, like the Angry Friar pub, on a small rocky headland that's nearly 1,000 miles south of Great Britain itself. Despite the physical distance, Gibraltar is still closely linked to the United Kingdom. In fact, just here across Main Street from Number 6, there stands the Convent, which is the residence of the Governor of Gibraltar, who represents none other than the British monarch. This historic building, then, is akin to Gibraltar's own Buckingham Palace, and it's been the Governor's residence for nearly 300 years, since the year 1728 in fact, just a short time after the territory of Gibraltar was ceded to Great Britain from Spain in 1713. Over the last 3 centuries, the British governors of Gibraltar have made the convent their home, with a lavish interior befitting their role as the king's representative. However, as the name suggests, the convent didn't begin life as a government residence, but rather as a Franciscan friary, a religious institution that was originally built nearly 500 years ago in the 16th century. Just beside the main building of the governor's residence, which was mostly rebuilt in the Georgian and Victorian eras, there stands the King's Chapel, which is one of the last remaining buildings of the historic friary, and one of the oldest buildings in the heart of Gibraltar. In fact, it's thought that this was the very first purpose-built church in all of Gibraltar. And despite having originally been opened in the era of Spanish rule, the King's Chapel retained its significance even after control moved to the British, and it's now used as the main place of worship for members of the armed forces in Gibraltar, while it's also open to visitors who wish to take a look inside as well. We, however, have much more to see than just the historic buildings here by the convent. So let's now begin making our way north across the heart of Gibraltar's city centre, along Main Street, which, as you might imagine, is the main street in Gibraltar. Main Street, always busy with people, mostly passes between the tall tower blocks that dominate the centre of this city. Although just here we encounter the spacious gardens outside of the Grand Magistrates Court, which was built just over 200 years ago in 1820. Now that year, 1820, points us towards an important period in Gibraltar's history, Because in the first half of the 19th century, this small territory began to rise to prominence as one of the most militarily and economically significant places in the whole world. At the beginning of the 19th century, less than 1,000 people lived here. But today, that number has risen to well over 30,000, with a vast network of streets and buildings crammed into a space smaller in size than Richmond Park in London. So the question has to be asked, why and how did all this happen? Well, to help us understand, let's take a look at a map. Because as you can see, not only is Gibraltar located near the southern tip of Europe's Iberian Peninsula, mostly made up of the countries of Spain and Portugal, it's also located just 9 miles from the North African nation of Morocco, just on the other side of the narrow Strait of Gibraltar. For context, that's more than half the distance between Dover and Calais across the English Channel. A natural choke point then on what came to be Britain's most important maritime trading route of all. Gibraltar's economic significance came from its position as the first major port that trading ships departing Great Britain would encounter on their way towards India, which became an even greater focus for the British Empire after the loss of its American colonies in 1776. This position as a major port and the economic opportunities that came with it led to an influx of people into Gibraltar throughout the 19th century. And to cater to the growing population's needs, many grand new buildings were constructed, like this one, the Cathedral of the Holy Trinity, probably the world's most distinctive Church of England cathedral. Built over 7 years from 1825 to 1832, this cathedral is clearly influenced by Islamic Moorish architecture, a reminder of Gibraltar's lengthy Moorish heritage, which spanned more than 700 years of the medieval era. The Moors, who arrived from North Africa on the other side of the strait, first settled the Rock of Gibraltar all the way back in the 8th century AD, as part of a wider Islamic conquest of Iberia that spread as far as the Pyrenees and even parts of what we now know as southern France. Similar to the Spanish and the British, Gibraltar here was a key military stronghold for the Moors. In fact, the name for this territory, Gibraltar, is actually derived from the Arabic Jabal Tariq, which literally means the Mount of Tariq, named after one Tariq ibn Ziyad, the Moorish military leader who spearheaded the first crossing of the Strait of Gibraltar, all the way back in the early 8th century. At the end of our walk, we'll visit the historic Moorish castle that was first constructed by Tariq, standing up on high on the Rock of Gibraltar, and still looming large over the modern city as a symbol of Gibraltar's centuries of Muslim rule. From here on Library Street, we can already see just how steeply the terrain rises up to the top of the rock from the heart of the city, which is built on a small, flat area of land on the western side of the mighty rock. This area of Gibraltar, known as the city centre, is just one part of a dense collection of streets and neighbourhoods that hug the western side of the rock, stretching all the way from the Spanish border, about a mile north of where we are now, to the very southern tip of Gibraltar, about 2 miles away, where the coast of North Africa is so close you could almost touch it. We'll get a clearer picture of the layout of this densely packed territory when we climb on up towards the Moorish castle later on. But don't think that all of Gibraltar is quite as claustrophobic and cavernous as the busy streets of the city centre here. Still, with such a heavy concentration of people living and working in this economic centre of the territory, there are plenty of shopping opportunities available on a stroll through the city centre. And despite being about 1,000 miles away from Great Britain, it's a delight to see plenty of familiar British high street brands in the sunny Mediterranean. This always popular branch of Marks & Spencer, for example, having first opened its doors on the Rock all the way back in 1968. If you're visiting Gibraltar from the UK, then spotting familiar names like this is a fun game to play as you explore the streets of the city centre. But just here, we've popped out of a narrow section of Main Street onto a more open square, which is dominated by the second of Gibraltar's two beautiful cathedrals, this one being the Catholic Cathedral of St Mary the Crowned. As we see it today, this elegant cathedral mostly dates back to 1810, but the truth is that this building has a much longer history. It stands on the site of what was once the main mosque in the Moorish settlement here, which was later taken over and demolished by the Spanish in 1462, who replaced it with a Catholic church. The Spanish-built church survived Gibraltar's takeover by the mostly Protestant British in the early 18th century, but it was eventually damaged beyond repair in the Great Siege of Gibraltar at the end of the same century. So it was rebuilt at roughly the same time as the Church of England cathedral that we saw earlier, and it still stands with some more recent additions today. Inside, the layout of the cathedral is actually loosely based on the historic plan of the old mosque, with a small open-air courtyard, the likes of which you wouldn't often see in Great Britain, but which is of course built for the warm Mediterranean climate here in Gibraltar, a climate which also allows bountiful orange trees to grow on the streets of the city centre here. This lovely grove is neighboured just across Main Street by a row of mighty palm trees as well, another unusual sight on a British high street, but one which provides some lovely scenery on this widened part of the city's narrow central thoroughfare. Just across the street from the cathedral, meanwhile, there stands a notable statue, dedicated to the Royal Engineers of the British Army, a leading army corps who've been serving here on the Rock since 1704, the year in which it was first taken by the British. Later in the 18th century, before the Great Siege, a locally sourced group of engineers banded together to plan and construct the immense fortifications surrounding Gibraltar that still stand today, and which we'll now make our way towards as we take a brief detour off Main Street. Of course, lining both sides of the city's busy central drag are an endless network of side streets, alleyways and more. A dizzying maze that's easy to get lost in, but where there's almost always something interesting to be found. Here, for example, we're walking along the oddly named Bomb House Lane, a lane which takes its name from the building that we can see just up ahead between the houses. Today, that is the Gibraltar National Museum, the perfect place to go to learn all there is to know about this storied British territory, and which is also home to a beautifully preserved complex of medieval Moorish baths in its basement, well worth a look to get a clear idea of just how long different people groups have been living here. However, before it was a museum, this building was known as the Bomb House, simply because it was the Gibraltar headquarters of the Board of Ordnance, a British government department that was responsible for the supply of munitions to the army and the navy. As we know, Gibraltar's strategic value has made it a key military stronghold for the British, the Spanish and the Moors through the centuries. But there are plenty more people groups who've made their home on the Rock here through time. Just here, for example, we're passing by the Line Wall Synagogue, one of a number of Jewish places of worship that you'll find on Gibraltar's streets, this one dating back to the 18th century, when it was founded by Dutch merchants, and as such is also often known to the locals as the Flemish Synagogue. In the 19th century, important places of worship like this, and many other buildings, were simply constructed on Gibraltar's streets wherever there was space, some on small side lanes like this one, and some even dangling higher up on the side of the Rock, as we'll see later. The reason, of course, was that Gibraltar's population was skyrocketing at the time, but people didn't necessarily have the whole territory to spread themselves out, in part because of the steep terrain of the Rock itself, and also owing to the fact that it was only the city centre here, which was surrounded by Gibraltar's famously impenetrable fortifications. Here, for example, we're making our way into the Line Wall Curtain, a lengthy line of military defences which runs along the western side of the city, and which was vital for fending off attacks on Gibraltar launched from the sea. Now, this was a worry that troubled not just the British, but also the Spanish and the Moors, And the fact is that the modern line wall curtain, which was built in the 18th century by the British, largely follows the line of much older Moorish and Spanish defences. From the curtain we can look back across the city, which is bounded on the other side by the immense Rock of Gibraltar, standing roughly 1,400 feet or 430 metres high. An immovable object, therefore, which served as the best natural defence possible for those who controlled this territory. On this flatter side of the city, however, there were no such natural defences. In fact, before sweeping land reclamation projects began in the 20th century, the waves of the Mediterranean Sea would have actually lapped against the walls here. So, to ensure maximum protection against an amphibious assault, the line wall curtain was beefed up with a number of large bastions, arrowhead-shaped towers which jutted out into the water. And this one, known as the King's Bastion, was arguably one of the most important of all. Built in 1773 and named for King George III, the King's Bastion was a crucial arm in the defence of Gibraltar during the Great Siege of 1779 to 1783, the longest siege in British military history. Gibraltar's western defences were commanded from the King's Bastion, which stood just a few hundred yards away from the main line of French and Spanish floating batteries, military strongholds literally anchored in the waters just off the coast of this small British territory. For more than 3.5 years, the line wall curtain that we're walking along here, and the rest of Gibraltar, was relentlessly bombarded by Spanish and French forces, who had surrounded and blockaded the territory. Their hope was that the British, at the time heavily occupied by the American Revolutionary War across the pond, would be unable to reinforce the defence of Gibraltar, and therefore those holding out in the territory would eventually have to surrender and return control of the rock to Spain. But as we know, the Spanish blockades and assaults, later also supported by a huge French force, were a failure. And soon after the Great Siege, Gibraltar began to flourish and grow as the 18th century turned to the 19th. This building across the road, for example, is an old Victorian casino that was built back in 1853, and which is a clear indicator of just how much wealth was around during this territory's heyday. As such a valuable port and economic centre, Victorian-era Gibraltar was still heavily defended, even serving as a major military base during the Crimean War as well. But the Great Siege of the late 18th century was the last time that Gibraltar was subjected to a truly intense attack, and the fortifications that remain standing today serve as an important reminder of just that. Interestingly, the King's Bastion, though visibly unchanged on the outside since the time of the siege, actually serves as a local leisure centre today, while many other parts of the walls have also been converted for community purposes since they were decommissioned in the 1960s and 70s. Vast land reclamation, as we can see here, has allowed Gibraltar's population to swell outside the bounds of its walls onto what were once the waters of the Mediterranean. But it's not just the scars of the Great Siege that we can see around this much prized territory. In fact, over the course of its history, Gibraltar has been subjected to no less than 14 sieges, the very first having taken place more than 700 years ago in the year 1309, when the Moors first surrendered their territory to the Kingdom of Castile, later to become part of Spain. A few centuries later, in 1704 meanwhile, the 11th Siege of Gibraltar, which was carried out by English and Dutch forces, led to the capture of the territory from Spain. And it was this turnover of control, during the War of Spanish Succession, that brought Gibraltar into British hands in the very first place. Ever since, Gibraltar has been tightly linked to Britain and its military. Just here on Line Wall Road, for example, we find the impressive Gibraltar War Memorial, which was erected back in 1923, and which pays tribute to those who lost their lives during the First World War. Hundreds of Gibraltarians, a large proportion of the territory's relatively small population, served in a number of different theatres of the First World War. And so this splendid monument serves as an impressive reminder of their role in the conflict, occupying a prominent position on the route of the line wall curtain, which would have originally been looking directly out to sea. But it's not only reminders of the First World War that could be found in this lively part of the city, because flanking either side of the British War Memorial, you'll find a number of large cannons, real cannons, that were captured from the Russians during the Crimean War of the mid-19th century. As we mentioned, Gibraltar served as a major military base during the Crimean War, its position on the Mediterranean making it a useful staging post for soldiers and equipment travelling to and from the main theatre of conflict in Eastern Europe. In recognition, 4 of these cannons were brought back and gifted to the city of Gibraltar, with 2 now located just here, and the other 2 to be found in Gibraltar's Botanic Gardens, just to the south of the city centre. So, having now taken a brief look at a number of different parts of Gibraltar's illustrious military heritage, let's cross the road and make our way away from the line wall curtain, and back into Gibraltar's network of busy streets. Separating Main Street from what was once the coast, here we stumble upon one of the largest squares in the city, officially named John Mackintosh Square, after the famous Gibraltarian philanthropist. However, this square is also affectionately known by locals as the Piazza, and overlooking it just up ahead, unfortunately covered in scaffolding at the minute, is Gibraltar's large Parliament building, the centre of the territory's self-governing legislature. Now, the Parliament building dates all the way back to 1817, and it was originally used as a trading exchange and library by local merchants. But in the mid-20th century, Gibraltar's political status with respect to the United Kingdom changed, and this building was chosen to take on the role of the territory's own Parliament House. When it first came under British control in the 18th century, Gibraltar was simply considered a fortress by the British government. But as the local population grew in the 19th century, its status was changed to that of a crown colony, which was ruled effectively single-handedly by a governor, in the name of the British monarch. The governor, based at the convent where we started our walk, had a monopoly on legal power in the territory, until the 1920s, when this building, Gibraltar City Hall, was converted from an old mansion to house the brand new City Council, a directly elected body by the people of Gibraltar. This was the first step on a long road towards greater representation and self-determination for Gibraltar, and in the 1940s a civil rights campaign, spearheaded by members of this city council, soon led to the creation of Gibraltar's own legal assembly in 1950, which is now the Gibraltar Parliament that sits right here on John Mackintosh Square. Despite the presence of unmistakably British symbols, like beautiful red phone booths, postboxes and more, Gibraltar today acts as an entirely self-governing territory, its democratically elected parliament responsible for the administration of the community living here, while the UK government, back in London, is responsible only for the territory's defence and foreign affairs. Technically speaking, Gibraltar's greater autonomy means that it's not a part of the UK in the same way as England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. But it is still undeniably British, the overwhelming majority of the local population strongly identifying as British nationals. That being said, there is also a unique Gibraltarian identity to be found among the local population, an identity which is perfectly exemplified right here on John Mackintosh Square. Here, for example, we're standing in front of the Main Guard, a former gatehouse which is the oldest building on John Mackintosh Square. And notably, it combines typical British Georgian architecture with a Mediterranean style suited to the warm climate here. There's much more to the Gibraltarian identity than that, however. In fact, in 1992, John Mackintosh Square here was actually chosen as the venue for the very first Gibraltar National Day, held on the 10th of September to commemorate Gibraltar's very first sovereignty referendum back in 1967. Interestingly though, the event provoked such an outpouring of national pride that John Mackintosh Square here was overwhelmed by the thousands of people who turned out. So National Day celebrations were eventually moved to the much larger Casemate Square for the following year, and we'll be visiting that plaza a little later on. But as we make our way off John Mackintosh Square and back onto the busy Main Street, there's another interesting part of Gibraltar's national identity which is worth mentioning: the local language. Of course, the language that you'll hear most often when walking the city streets is English, while Spanish is also very common, as many people who work in the city actually commute here from the Spanish town of La Linea, just a short walk across the border from here. But before the Second World War, relatively few native Gibraltarians actually spoke fluent English. Instead, they conversed mostly in an intriguing and unique local dialect which blends both Spanish and English, a dialect known as Llanito. Llanito, based mostly on Spanish, incorporates lots of English words and grammar, as well as many words from the languages of other people groups who've settled on the Rock in the past, including Hebrew, Portuguese, and Genoese, originally from Italy. Through the years, and particularly during periods when relations between Gibraltar and Spain were at a low ebb, the Llanito dialect established itself as a main language ahead of Spanish. Although in the modern day, English has grown even further, gradually replacing Llanito in everyday conversations in the territory. But although Llanito is best known for the way it combines Spanish and English, the name of the dialect is also an interesting insight into the fact that many more different people groups have lived on the Rock through time. Some say that Llanito, which literally means little flat land in Spanish, refers to the flat area of land here on the west side of the Rock. But it's also been suggested that the name actually comes from the Genoese dialect, Llanito, referring to the legacy of Genoese settlement here over time. In the 19th century, when Llanito was spoken more widely than it is today, more than a third of all the men who were living in Gibraltar were from Genoa, now part of Italy, as much of the southern Iberian coast was regularly frequented by Genoese sailors over the centuries. Many of these men were named Gianni, giving birth to the nickname Llanito, for the language that they ended up speaking here, alongside people from British, Spanish, Jewish, Portuguese backgrounds, and many, many more. But let's now move on from the intriguing history of Gibraltar's homegrown language, because just off Main Street here, we're walking up the narrow Bell Lane, which takes us slightly upwards towards the side of the Rock. Small side streets like this are often a great place to find independent shops, bars and restaurants off the busy main drag through the city. But as we mentioned earlier, the city's street layout has been in existence for hundreds of years now, and most of the street names that we know today are actually rather new. Before Gibraltar was ceded to Britain, it was of course under Spanish rule. But even after control of the Rock changed hands, many of the Spanish place names stuck. Here, for example, we're looking up the stairs of Castle Street, named in English as it leads up towards the Moorish castle higher up the Rock. But as recently as the 19th century, this narrow stairway was known as Calle Comedia, Spanish for Comedy Street, as it was home to a theatre where many people would often flock to enjoy plays. Here in between Bell Lane and Castle Street, meanwhile, we find a wider road which was once called La Plaza de la Verdura, literally Vegetable Square. As you can probably guess, it was here that the local vegetable market was once held, and after the British takeover of Gibraltar, the name was simply translated to the rather quaint-sounding Green Market Lane, though today it's known as Cornwall's Parade, after the 18th century governor of Gibraltar, Edward Cornwallis. Now, given the city's relatively small size, street names were for a long time a rather more casual affair than elsewhere in the world. In fact, it wasn't until as late as the 1870s that street signs were first introduced to Gibraltar, as beforehand, referencing a market, a theatre, or any other given landmark was normally more than enough to help people find their way. Frustratingly for many locals, however, most of the first official street signs that were erected in the 1870s arbitrarily renamed long-standing street names, with local landmarks often being replaced for references to British culture and heritage, such as this narrow lane, which was named Cornwall's Lane, again a reference to a former governor. At the time, this caused immense confusion for the people of Gibraltar, and was one of a number of frustrations that locals held with the governor and the British government back in London. And even today you might still hear long-term residents referring to some streets by their old English or even Spanish names. Now, despite the lengthy history of the streets of Gibraltar, the buildings that we see lining them today are almost all much newer. The Great Siege of Gibraltar, which took place over those 3.5 years at the end of the 18th century, caused major damage to almost every single building in the city centre. And while a few pre-siege buildings do still survive, like the King's Chapel that we saw earlier and the main guard gatehouse on John Mackintosh Square, the vast majority of landmarks in the centre of Gibraltar date from after the turn of the 19th century. Because of that, as we make our way into Market Lane, just on the other side of Main Street, Gibraltar is a city whose centuries and centuries of history aren't immediately apparent as you navigate your way around. And in fact, most of the residential buildings in the city centre are even newer, mostly built as apartment blocks throughout the 20th century to allow as many people as possible to live in this small area of land beside the rock. Of course, people don't just live in the city centre within the old fortifications. In fact, Gibraltar's population is spread out onto land reclaimed from the sea in the 21st century, to the winding roads of the Upper Town and the South District, the small community located on the east side of the rock, and there's even a scattered collection of houses and farms high up on the rock itself, inside what is today the sprawling Gibraltar Nature Reserve. We'll talk more about the beautiful natural wilderness of the rock a little later on. But for obvious reasons, it was within the fortifications that the vast majority of people settled in Gibraltar. And here, parallel to Main Street, we find ourselves walking through Irish Town, which, as the name suggests, was once upon a time a hotbed of Irish settlement. Now, like everywhere else in the city, this street was once known by an entirely different name, the Calle de Santa Ana, as it was once home to a convent for nuns, which was founded back in the late 16th century. However, when Gibraltar passed into British hands in the early 18th century, the old convent was closed down, and the community of nuns who once lived here was soon replaced by a small number of Irish women, most of whom moved to Gibraltar to provide company, to put it delicately, to the large number of soldiers stationed on the rock. Inevitably, this narrower street, just beside the city's central thoroughfare, gained a bit of a reputation during that period, so much so that the name Irish Town has stuck more than 300 years later. And that's despite the fact that there's no record of further Irish settlement in this part of the city afterwards. Still, you'll see plenty of references to this street and the surrounding area's Gaelic heritage today, with the odd Irish-themed pub standing between green-painted doors and windows, in what later became a leading area of industry in the city. In fact, in the 20th century, the buildings of Irish Town, which now house shops and restaurants, were used as everything from tobacco factories to the offices of shipping companies. There's not much else in the way of Irish symbolism on display in Irish Town, but just here we find a flagpole outside a shop from which there hangs the flag of Gibraltar. This flag, alongside the British Union Jack, is the one that you'll see flying from buildings all over the territory, instantly recognisable for its white and red stripes, and the castle and key from the coat of arms featured in the centre. As we explained at the start of our walk outside number 6, Gibraltar's coat of arms is a symbol of its key role as a fortress on the Mediterranean Sea. But despite being commonly used as a symbol of Gibraltarian pride in the modern day, the coat of arms can actually trace its history back to before the era of British rule. In fact, it was the Spanish Queen Isabella of Castile who first granted the castle and key coat of arms to Gibraltar, all the way back in the year 1502. Interestingly, despite the strength of British national identity among Gibraltar's population, this is the only British overseas territory whose flag doesn't feature the Union Jack in any form. The likes of the Falkland Islands, Bermuda, St Helena and more, all flying flags that feature both the British flag and their own local coat of arms. When it comes to Gibraltar's National Day on the 10th of September, Main Street here is often a sea of red and white, as the territory's flag is waved by thousands making their way towards the celebrations on Casemate Square, which we'll now make our way towards. Now, Gibraltar's Main Street looks pretty much like any other British high street, but this major thoroughfare is no exception to the many local streets which were once very different. Main Street was first laid out back in the 14th century, when Gibraltar was controlled by the Moors, and it ran from the northern gates of the city, just on the other side of Casemate Square from here, to what are now the Southport gates, near to the convent, where we started our walk. When the territory came under Spanish control, this street was developed further, and named Calle Real, or Royal Street. And although it was eventually renamed Main Street by the British, it follows largely the same path that it has for the past 700 years, running for around 2/3 of a mile across the heart of this bustling city. There are of course plenty more riveting side streets and lanes that spurt off Main Street, which are well worth exploring if you have the time. But hopefully you won't mind as we've whizzed along through the centre of Gibraltar, and past just a few of the city's most intriguing landmarks, because there's much more to see, even beyond the bounds of the lively Main Street. We'll soon be making our way up the steep side of the Rock of Gibraltar towards the more than 1,000-year-old Moorish castle. But before we do that, we can't miss an opportunity to explore Gibraltar's largest city square of all, Grand Casemate Square. Best known as the venue for National Day celebrations in the modern day, this sprawling plaza offers a nice change of scenery from the narrow streets of the city centre. And it's home to a vast array of cafes, restaurants, bars and more, whose chairs and tables spill out onto the square. But as well as a place to sit down and have a meal, Casemate Square is also another spot that's full of heritage. As you'll notice just up ahead, the square's northern side is lined by a long row of grey, stone-built barracks, which occupy part of what was once the northern wall of the Moors' fortifications of the city. Construction of these barracks began in the 1770s, as part of the wider modernisation of Britain's fortifications surrounding Gibraltar. But as well as serving as a residence for soldiers, they were also used as a casemate, a fortified structure used to house gun emplacements for defending the city. As a result, the buildings became known as the Grand Casemates, and after they eventually opened in 1817, around 40 years after work had first begun, the square that stood just outside took the name Grand Casemate Square. But once again, there's much more to this square than just its British-era heritage. In fact, this open space is thought to have been in existence since the peak of the Moorish period, likely first laid out in the 12th century, on top of what would have once upon a time been a small sandy beach. Located just beside the water, it's believed that this square was once used by the Moors as a place where they beached and repaired large galley ships, a practice which was even continued by the Spanish for the first century of their period of control here. But throughout the period of British control, Grand Casemates has evolved to become Gibraltar's main city square, on which we also find this monument, dedicated to all of the local Gibraltarians who served in defence of the Rock during the Second World War. Now, despite Gibraltar's rich military heritage, we've not yet mentioned the Second World War, despite the fact that this highly strategic fortress and port on the Mediterranean was coveted by Britain's enemies. Initially, Gibraltar started the Second World War relatively under-defended, as it had been more than 150 years since the last major siege of the Rock. But in 1940, when the British government feared that Francoist Spain was set to join the war on the side of the Nazis, they needed to turn the clock all the way back to the era of the Great Siege, and return the fortress of Gibraltar to its impenetrable state once again. To do this, there were two main considerations. Firstly, since the time of the Great Siege, Gibraltar had developed into a major port city, with a large civilian population of thousands, who could all be vulnerable in the event of an attack. So, as we now make our way onto Crutchett's Ramp, heading up towards the castle, to protect the locals of Gibraltar, the territory's entire civilian population was evacuated, initially to Morocco, and later in the war to London, the Portuguese island of Madeira, and even Jamaica on the other side of the Atlantic. With the civilian population gone, only a small handful of locals with essential jobs were allowed to stay on through the war, and they helped the military to fortify the rock to modern standards. Most famously, more than 30 miles of tunnels were dug into the Rock of Gibraltar itself to help defend the territory, following in the footsteps of the successful defence during the Great Siege, much of which was helped by the use of tunnels literally inside the rock. All of this planning proved vital throughout the Second World War, as Gibraltar reconfirmed its significance to Britain by serving as a key base for naval battles in the Atlantic, a major stopping point for Allied troops travelling to North Africa and Italy, and an important point of control at the entrance to the Mediterranean Sea. Ultimately, Spain's decision to stay neutral throughout the war thwarted any of the Nazis' attempts to actually capture Gibraltar, and by the 1950s, the once evacuated civilian population had returned to the territory, while the great military defences that had protected the rock were soon decommissioned. However, as we mentioned earlier, vast parts of Gibraltar's historic defences remain intact to this day, and if you venture up away from the city centre towards the top of the rock, you'll stumble across countless examples of historic military posts from the Moorish period, the Great Siege, the First World War, and the Second World War. In a minute or so, we'll reach the Granada Gate, a Moorish and Spanish-era gateway that was once the main point of access to this part of Gibraltar, known to the Spanish as the Villa Vieja, the Old Town. Now, the Villa Vieja, made out of a collection of higgledy-piggledy streets and lanes slightly higher up the side of the rock than the modern city centre, can trace its history back to the very first settlement of Gibraltar by the Moors, led by Tariq ibn Ziyad back in the 8th century. For a long time, the main centre of the Moorish settlement was here in the upper part of the Villa Vieja, the height and proximity to the castle proving an ideal defence for those living here. So while this part of Gibraltar today is almost entirely residential, it was for centuries a centre of activity, particularly during the Moorish period. And that's why it's here that we find what was once one of the city's main gates from that era, the Granada Gate. Once upon a time, this was a large monumental arched gateway, and although it was first built by the Moors, possibly around the 14th century, it was also used throughout the Spanish era, and they named it the Granada Gate simply because it was the main gate which, upon leaving Gibraltar, would lead you north towards the Andalusian city of Granada. In front of the gate today, we now find a scattering of more modern, British-era defensive structures, because by the time of Gibraltar's transfer of control to Britain, the population centre had moved further down the side of the rock towards what we now know as the city centre. And by the mid-18th century, the British decided to destroy the old Granada Gate here, as they redeveloped the defences surrounding the city and the rock itself. Now, as we know, the historic fortifications surrounding Gibraltar, not to mention the 400-metre-tall rock itself, have long made this territory a major stronghold for those who've controlled it through time. But we haven't yet explored the story of how Gibraltar, located more than 1,000 miles from Great Britain, came to be a British territory. After Iberia was retaken from the Moors by the Christians in the Reconquista of the late 15th century, Gibraltar spent more than 200 years under Spanish rule. But as the 18th century rolled around, Spain, a major European power, found itself in crisis after the death of the childless King Charles II. Despite having no direct heir, Spain's King Charles nominated one Philippe Anjou, the grandson of the French King Louis XIV, to be the next King of Spain. But this troubled other powers across Europe, who believed that Spain would become a client state of France, giving the French a dominant position on the continent. In 1701, these concerns boiled over into the War of the Spanish Succession, and the British, keen to avoid French domination of Europe, entered the war as part of what was known as the Grand Alliance, also composed of the Dutch, the Holy Roman Empire, and later Portugal and a number of other European kingdoms. This is where Gibraltar entered the picture. This major fortress at the entrance to the Mediterranean, which was mostly dominated by the French navy, was eyed up by the Grand Alliance as a vital harbour and base to conduct operations in the Mediterranean Sea. And so in August of 1704, a vast force of more than 60 English and Dutch warships laid siege to Gibraltar, capturing the rock after 3 days of battle. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw Grand Alliance troops sacking and looting much of the town, while Spanish locals sought to rebel and remove them. Though ultimately, most locals decided to pack up and leave, expecting that the Spanish forces would eventually retake their hometown. Attempts were made by the Spanish and the French to retake Gibraltar, but the rock remained in British hands for the rest of the war, which eventually ended in 1715 with defeat for the Grand Alliance, as Louis XIV's grandson became Philip V of Spain. The war was ended, however, by a treaty signed by Britain and the rest of the Grand Alliance with Spain and France, a treaty known as the Peace of Utrecht. This treaty was the result of a long period of secret negotiations between the two sides, and in return for Philip taking the Spanish throne, Spain ceded Gibraltar and the Mediterranean island of Minorca, which had also been captured during the war, to Britain in perpetuity. In other words, forever. This agreement is why Gibraltar is a British overseas territory today, although Minorca, which remained British for much of the 18th century, was ultimately recaptured in 1781 by the French and the Spanish. But Gibraltar famously held out in the Great Siege that lasted more than 3 years. And just here, we find a row of defences which played their own part in defending the rock during the Great Siege. This line of walls situated among the uppermost defences at the top of the Old Town, which was targeted by bombardments from France's fearsome floating batteries out in the water, just to the west of the city centre. Those batteries would have been located just beyond the tower blocks that we can see in the distance from this stunning vantage point, which not only gives us a view over the city centre and the higgledy-piggledy rooftops of the Old Town, but also even further across the Mediterranean. As we spin the camera around, look into the distance beyond the buildings of Gibraltar here, and you'll see the mountains and towns of Spain surrounding the Bay of Algeciras, one of the most important shipping harbours in all of Spain. Looking south across the Strait of Gibraltar, meanwhile, and we can also take in a breathtaking view of the coast of Morocco in North Africa, which is located just over 10 miles away from our position here. That view really puts into context just how narrow the Strait of Gibraltar is. After all, you can only just about make out the coastline of France when you stand on top of the White Cliffs of Dover. But the mountains of North Africa are little more than a stone's throw across the water from here. Of course, that also goes to show just how important control of Gibraltar has been through time, with every ship passing through the strait easily visible to those on the rock. Although if we keep climbing even higher up, then we'll find plenty more vantage points with an even clearer view across the sea. Now here, as we turn right onto Upper Castle Road, we've reached the upper boundary of Gibraltar's historic fortifications, the core of the city now located well beneath our feet. However, there's of course much more to this territory than the city. The Rock of Gibraltar itself is a vast and beautiful area of nature and wilderness that feels worlds away from the narrow streets and lanes of the city centre. And today the Upper Rock, just a few streets further up from where we are now, serves as a nature reserve, open to visitors all year round. Unfortunately, we won't quite have time to visit the Upper Rock on our walk today, but do stay tuned for another video on this channel where we'll explore all that the nature reserve has to offer in depth, from the stunning views at the top of the rock to the riveting tunnels of the Great Siege and the Second World War, and of course the world-famous Barbary macaques of Gibraltar, often called Europe's very last population of wild monkeys. Now, you won't encounter any monkeys here on the edges of the densely populated Old Town, but what you will find in this part of town are the remains of the historic Moorish castle, the very first major defensive structure that gave birth to the Fortress of Gibraltar. Just there, we've made our way through a gate, which leads us into what's known as the Moorish Castle Estate, or in Arabic, the Kasbah, where people lived within the grounds of the castle itself. Now, the civilian settlement of Gibraltar, which came to be encircled by defensive walls, developed at the foot of the castle, particularly from the 12th century onwards, when the Moors went from using the rock mostly as a military post to a place of major permanent settlement. Now, as we mentioned earlier on, the Moorish castle can trace its origins all the way back to the early 8th century AD, when a defensive structure was built by Tariq ibn Ziyad as he led his troops on a conquest of Iberia. And it occupied a vast area of land on this prominent part of the rock, with a perfect view looking towards the lands of Spain to the north. This military stronghold was of vital importance to the Moors, initially in their control over conquered lands in Iberia, and later in their conflict with the Christian kingdom of Castile, with whom they battled for power over Gibraltar for nearly 2 centuries. The very first siege of Gibraltar, which took place all the way back in 1309, actually saw the Castilians take control of the rock from the Moors. And it wasn't for another 24 years, until the third siege of Gibraltar in 1333, that the Moors were able to retake the territory from Castile. After retaking Gibraltar, the Moors redeveloped much of the defences surrounding the town and the castle. And that's why much of the Moorish castle as we see it today, including these walls surrounding the Kasbah, date from around the time of the 14th century, as the Moorish defenders sought to retain control from the Castilians. That includes this large tower, known as the Almond Tower, after its almond-like shape. Built at some point in the 14th century, the Almond Tower is one of the best preserved of the Moorish castle's outer defences. And in fact, some parts of the wall that it defends feature stonework dating back even further in time, to the 12th century in fact. These greater defences allowed the Moors to retain control of Gibraltar for more than a century, withstanding 4 further sieges before eventually surrendering for the very last time in 1462, when the 8th siege of Gibraltar saw power over the rock move into Spanish hands. As we know, it was another 242 years until the Spanish period would come to an end, when the capture of Gibraltar by the English and Dutch was confirmed when Grand Alliance troops raised their flag atop the Moorish castle. There's much more to the Moorish castle than what we see here. In fact, you can even explore the famous Tower of Homage, the Moorish Baths, and much more of the inner castle complex when you visit the nature reserve on the Upper Rock. Well worth continuing the walk to see. But for us, it's here beside the castle's fetching Almond Tower that we've reached the end of our walk around the historic heart of Gibraltar. Having strolled along Main Street, navigated the back lanes, explored a variety of city squares, and climbed up through the Old Town to this point, we've been on quite the journey through Gibraltar's illustrious history. Although it's fair to say that we've only just scratched the surface of this enthralling British overseas territory. Do look out for another video exploring the nature reserve and yet more of Gibraltar's main sites that we didn't visit on this walk. But for now, all that's left to say is thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're looking forward to visiting Gibraltar for yourself sometime soon.